If you pay a closer attention, look at what's happening around the world today. Of course, on one hand, we're still questioning or we're still interested in knowing regarding the war in Ukraine. But meanwhile, and how about another country on the planet, which is Haiti? Now, regarding Haiti, this country is undergoing this tremendous political and also this economic struggles. And the question we should ask is, what is going to happen to the country in the long run? And how about this international intervention? And how many people are questioning the methodologies or even the effectiveness of international intervention? So that's why today in this episode, we're going to talk about the current political and also this economic crisis in Haiti. And meanwhile, we need to discuss how about the effectiveness of international support and regarding to solve the crisis. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite Professor John Ciorciari. Now, Professor Ciorciari is Associate Dean for Research and Policy Engagement at the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. And of course, one of his amazing books that I read is entitled Sovereignty Sharing in the Fragile States. Professor Ciorciari, welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you so much for having me, Will.
You're welcome, sir. The pleasure's all mine. Now, as we mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because this amazing article that you wrote and entitled Intervening in Haiti Again. Now, again, as we mentioned, this country, Haiti, is undergoing this tremendous political and also this economic turmoil. Can you help us to understand what is exactly happening in this country and why is it so concerning to the international community?
Unfortunately, Will, Haiti has been in various degrees of crisis for a long time, but the violence it's experiencing now is arguably the most severe since the mid-1980s, when its dictatorship fell and was replaced ultimately by a fragile democracy. Haiti is facing several interrelated challenges at the moment. One is that in 2017, a long-standing UN peacekeeping operation concluded in Haiti, and the international forces that had been present in the country and had been contributing to its at least partial stability went away, and gangs and other actors engaged in violent, illicit activity, some of whom have connections to senior state officials, began to assert themselves again, to contest territory, to engage in often politically linked violence. A few years later, Haiti faced the pandemic, as we all did, and was ill-prepared for it. Haiti has very weak state institutions, was not in a position to be able to secure vaccines or otherwise prepare its population, and so it suffered a particularly acute bout with coronavirus. Haiti also was caught up in an economic storm brought on not only by the pandemic and not only by the weakness of its institutions and escalating violence, but also by a couple of devastating earthquakes that rocked this small half-island country and destroyed a lot of its infrastructure and displaced a lot of its people. And so Haiti was facing escalating violence, facing a severe outbreak of COVID, facing earthquakes, economic decay, and on top of that, the government that I described as a fragile democracy had become increasingly autocratic, and President Jovenel Moïse in July of 2021 was brazenly assassinated in his residence by a group of armed gunmen. After Moïse's assassination, there was a transitional government, an unelected government that took shape in Haiti with some international backing in order to tie over the country's politics until the next election. Unfortunately, the political crisis stemming from the assassination only added to the country's sense of instability and insecurity. And gang violence, kidnappings, movement of drugs have all increased in the year since Moïse was assassinated. Right now, there's no election in sight. The country's economy continues to reel. And there's been a large exodus of Haitian refugees, some of whom have been turned back and sent home by the United States. And so Haiti is facing quite a storm of interrelated social, economic, political, and humanitarian challenges.
Professor, I think when you mentioned, again, during the previous answer that you shared with us, one thing that we need to address is the legitimacy of the government. As you mentioned before, the previous president was tragically assassinated, but right now there's no election taking place in Haiti. And of course, under the current unelected government officials, this country is in turmoil. Now, can you help us to understand the much greater impact of this legitimacy or illegitimacy of the government? Because when we talk about a country who's undergoing this tremendous political and also this economic crisis, there has to be a sense of hope, or there has to be a sense of, how can I say, recognition of the reshape up of the government. But right now, based on what you share with us, this isn't taking place in Haiti. And so help us to understand how illegitimate is the government, and why has there anything done about this?
Haiti's illegitimacy, the Haitian government's illegitimacy, can really best be understood in historical context. Haiti is the world's first independent Black republic, but Haitian leaders in the late 18th and early 19th centuries took over from French colonial overlords who were notoriously repressive. And the political economy that Haitian leaders inherited was one based on plantation system, based on slavery and repression of the ordinary citizens. And so Haiti had a long history in the 19th century and the early 20th century of repressive government and centralization of wealth in the hands of a relatively small number of people. In 1915, a Haitian president was assassinated, and the last time that assassination of this kind happened, the United States stepped in, but rather than stepping in briefly and removing itself, the U.S. stayed for 19 years and engaged in an occupation of Haiti that was racially charged and imperious. That has left a lasting suspicion among ordinary Haitians of foreign intervention in the country. During the Cold War, Haiti returned to a period of unwanted foreign intervention when the United States and others supported dictatorships in the country because they had strong anti-communist credentials. And so the Duvaliers, so-called Papa Doc and Baby Doc, were both leaders that received significant outside support, not just from the U.S., but also from other Western governments, because they were seen as a bulwark against communist expansion in the Caribbean. Ordinary Haitians looked at that and said, again, we're not choosing our leaders. The outside world is responsible for choosing our leaders, a continuation of the colonial legacy, albeit in a different form. In the early 90s, Jean-Bertrand Aristide was elected, and an overwhelming number of Haitians came to the polls to elect this leader who was outspoken in his suspicion of U.S. influence and other foreign influence in the country. He was ousted in a coup in 1991, just a year after he was swept to power in an election. And again, Haitians wondered, was this coup indigenous in nature, or was it supported by outside powers who wanted a ruler who would be more compliant? And so a lot of Haitians believed that the United States was involved in supporting that coup. Somewhat ironically, in 1994, the United States brought Aristide back to power as part of a multinational force that ousted the military leadership that had taken over in the coup and tried to implement the framework for more democratic governance in the country, including the creation of a new police force to replace the discredited and abusive Haitian armed forces. That continued for about a decade until, amid further unrest, the United States was instrumental in Aristide's removal from power and his replacement by a new leadership that was buttressed by the UN peacekeeping mission I referenced earlier. All along the way, Haitians are wondering, again, are we engaged in self-determination, or are outsiders calling the shots? For a while, René Préval, as prime minister, was able to restore some degree of security to the country. But in 2010, the devastating earthquake that many of your listeners will have heard about struck the country, decimated many of the government buildings and much of the infrastructure in the capital of Port-au-Prince, and brought a new round of instability and insecurity in the country. When the dust settled from the earthquake, a new Haitian government took power under the leadership of the pop singer Michel Martelly, who was seen as another U.S.-friendly leader. Haitians had elected Martelly, but with a lower turnout to the polls. By 2016, when Jovenel Moïse was elected to replace Martelly, Haitian participation in the election had plummeted, so that only a small fraction of Haitians exercised their right to vote, an indication that Haitians didn't think that there was much point in going to the polls because someone else was going to essentially choose the leader for them.
That's right.
And we continue to the present, and we have now an unelected government that many Haitians believe is both representative of a small elite that continues to wield power in the country, and that many Haitians also believe is able to stay in power because he has the backing of France, Canada, the US, and other influential foreign powers. And so my point in narrating this long arc of history is to convey that there's nothing new about the challenge of a deficit in public trust for the Haitian government. This is a problem that has existed throughout the country's history and that is intimately related not only to the corruption and malfeasance of Haitian elites, but also to the serial intervention of foreign powers.
You know, Professor, it's interesting that you mentioned that how the United States of America or any other countries, number one, had good intention to intervene this political crisis when the fragile states are undergoing, again, this crisis. But meanwhile, within your article that you wrote specifically, you mentioned not only the Haitians, but also, again, and put in a greater scale, people are tending to resentful towards this international intervention because we know, now, again, going back to what I said before, not only the US, but also other countries, everyone is watching what's happening around the world, and everyone is showing compassion and showing sympathy. Of course, that most effectively would love to bring economic or political support to the countries which is undergoing this crisis. But why do you think it's better, or correct me if I'm wrong, Professor, why do you think it's better that when it comes to domestic issues, it's better to be solved domestically without actually having intervention or having the support from the outside? So in other words, how necessary, or is it really necessary for countries such as US, such as Mexico, or any other countries to intervene for another country's economic or political crisis?
I think that foreign intervention works when it resonates with the will of the population in a given country, or at least with a majority of the population and the government elites. Where it tends to fail, or at least to struggle, is when foreign intervention is seen as being inconsistent with the aspirations of the majority domestic constituencies. And in the case of Haiti, there is, for the historical reasons I mentioned, a long legacy of mounting distrust of foreign interventions. It was exacerbated by the UN peacekeeping mission, which introduced cholera to Haiti and then engaged in a cover-up of the release of cholera into a river that many Haitians use for drinking water. It was also reduced by a series of sexual abuse scandals in which the United Nations didn't appear to be holding its own peacekeepers accountable for abuses. And it was reduced by the sense that the major governments, including France, Canada, and the US, were supporting particular leaders and buttressing them to serve their own interests and not necessarily the interests of the Haitian people. In that context, it would be very risky, to say the least, for international actors to reappear on the scene and to communicate in some way that they had a plan for how to remedy the political problems in Haiti. They simply don't have the trust in the eyes of the population to be able to do that credibly. A process that's going to garner public support has to be regarded by the Haitian people as one that originated in Haiti. It's fine once such a plan is identified for international actors to support it and to buttress it. But if it appears to Haitians that international actors are calling the shots again, they're very likely to be distrustful and non-cooperative. And that's a recipe for a failed intervention.
Professor, I want to read something that you wrote for this article, and I quote, "The Biden administration has rightly been wary of committing U.S. forces given the U.S. history in Haiti and the danger of mission creep. The last time a Haitian president was assassinated in 1915, U.S. troops intervened to stem mob violence and stayed to occupy the country for nearly 2 decades." Comparing with what's happened in 1915, and of course today we're living in the age of 2022. Now, it's interestingly, Professor, you use the word has rightly been wary of committing U.S. Now, we know that today, when we look at the domestic political changes and also this foreign relations under Joe Biden, do you think that U.S. today, not only for Haiti, but for any other countries that who's undergoing crisis politically or economically, is it time for U.S. to take a step back, really focus on or to take care of the domestic chaos instead of reaching out too much, or instead of putting finger in every single pie when it comes to international crisis? Because we know that today, it might sound selfish to say we need to put our country first as a priority. But meanwhile, it is the reality that if we can only if we cannot take care of our own people, how could the international community expect the much greater promises or much greater economic or political support for any other countries? What is your take on that?
You've certainly captured the mood of many Democrats and Republicans in the United States who believe that the energy of the administration should be focused primarily on challenges at home, and that to the extent that the United States engages in missions overseas, that it should be prioritizing major strategic threats to the United States emanating from other major powers. The idea for the Biden administration of intervening in Haiti is politically unappetizing. After all, Biden has been much criticized for the withdrawal from Afghanistan and has only recently managed to extricate the United States from that quagmire, and is no doubt not eager at all to be seen as engaging in another fragile state on the eve of midterm elections. So you absolutely captured the mood inside of the United States. Now, there's a separate question of whether the U.S. should, despite those political wins, consider intervening in cases like Haiti, where there are severe humanitarian challenges. There are millions of innocent Haitian people who face peril because violence is spiking, the economy's plummeting, natural disasters, COVID, and so forth. I believe that the United States should remain prepared to engage in such circumstances, but not when it doesn't have a strong political foundation for intervention. And that political foundation starts with an understanding of what the local population demands and what the local political elite is capable of delivering in terms of a country's political future. And I think right now the United States has been considering a possible intervention without identifying a roadmap for Haiti's political future. And that seems to me a recipe for problems.
Professor, again, as we mentioned in the intro, and I am so honored and fortunate to read one of the books that you wrote, which is called Sovereignty Sharing in Fragile States. And of course, I have to admit that after reading that book, or a large proportion of the book, number one, it was very enlightening. And number two, helped me to understand the word sovereignty in the fragile states. Now, let's talk about your book a little bit. Within the book, that you kept on using the word peacemaking. Of course, today, that when we look at this political shift or this economic challenges across the world, in order to build this harmonious or peaceful society, it's number one, it's challenging. And number two, when we see the countries who are undergoing this political crisis, having this peaceful state, it's almost it's a far too beyond our understanding. Now, my question to you is, how possible or how likely it is today that we can build a peaceful or harmonious society for some of the fragile states. And I don't just mean the countries of Haiti, but also when we look at the countries in Southeast Asia, we'll look at some of the countries in Africa. Those countries, the citizens or constituents are longing for harmonious unity or harmonious society for so long. But because the political base is so fragile, how likely we can achieve that goal for those states or for those countries?
You're right that it's extremely challenging. I wrote a book about sovereignty sharing. And what I mean by sovereignty here is not the way we typically refer to sovereignty as a shield against unwanted foreign intervention. I'm referring to the sovereign authority that flows from a government's recognition as sovereign. So the domestic authority that flows from recognition as sovereign. What powers does a government have inside of its territory with respect to its people by virtue of being sovereign? And that authority can be shared. For example, a government can say, we're not able right now to handle vaccinations, and so we're going to hand that over to the World Health Organization, or we're not able to handle policing in this area of the country. We're going to invite the United Nations to send police or peacekeepers. We can't handle trying war crime suspects because it's too politically sensitive, so we will invite UN appointees to come participate in a tribunal. Those are examples of shared sovereignty. And the question you're asking is a good one. Could those type of ventures reasonably be expected to contribute to peace building and to sustainable peace in a country? And in general, the answer has been that they are certainly not on their own sufficient. But in some cases, they're able to contribute in meaningful ways when certain conditions exist. Number one, they have to be regarded as legitimate by the presence or involvement of external actors has to be regarded as legitimate by the host state society. And there are a few ways of legitimating. Elite consent or government consent is one way. Good intentions might be another way. And oftentimes these interventions do have the best of intentions. But I argue that the most important way that international actors gain legitimacy is through performance. They have to demonstrate to a skeptical public that their involvement leads to better services, better governance than the host state was doing prior to the intervention. If external actors are not able to demonstrate that, they'll almost certainly not have legitimacy. There's nothing about being an outsider who's unelected in a country that's not my own that would give me legitimacy for a sustained time, unless I can demonstrate to the people that I'm providing better services. So then the question arises, well, what is it that makes these missions effective in helping to deliver the kinds of services that contribute to peace building? One factor is whether or not the preferences align with those of the local elites, whether the government is actually willing to cooperate with the external interveners toward common aims. And a separate factor is whether their shared aims align with those of the general population. The government and the international actors might have shared interests, but those might not be what the people want. And so you need both of those components in order to have a favorable political foundation for international intervention. When one does have that positive foundation, it's possible to imagine a successful peacekeeping mission or a successful inoculation campaign or a successful tribunal. And although those interventions may not themselves contribute in the aggregate to sustained peace, they help, and they can help to develop confidence in the government and hopefully added public compliance with the law, cooperation with the authorities, and one hopes that one gets a virtuous cycle of legitimacy and effectiveness.
Professor, I know you're very busy. I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about the word democracy. As we mentioned before, or something that you shared going back to the initial conversation, because this ongoing political and also social or economic instability in Haiti, we've seen protests and riots were taking place. Of course, that if we take a step back today, because the fragile states and because the fragility of those states, people, especially the younger generations, are more likely to voice their oppositions through protests and through riots. Of course, that really tie into the concept of freedom. So my next question to you, Professor, is how significant or how important it is that when we have the freedom, or when we have the opportunity for the constituents to voice their oppositions, to hold rallies or protests towards the unfair or unofficial or unelected government today. Because we know some countries are suppressing heavily on those political rhetoric or on this political freedom, so to speak. So help us to understand, I know this is something that you also mentioned in the book as well, since the states are fragile, since the states are in the deep crisis, how should we understand the importance or the significance of the freedom of speech and freedom of opposition?
In a fragile state, there is a race in time between the point when a government tries to democratize and the point when the people get fed up with its failure to deliver services. There is a window of time in which the people will tolerate a government that has democratic credentials and allow it to see if it is able to deliver better services than the repressive government that came before it. In most countries, including Haiti, that move toward democratic elections, in the first few elections, lots of people come out and vote because they believe, they hope that their voice through these legal channels will effectuate positive change, that it will deliver leadership that will be providing the services that they want. If time goes on and a government is not delivering those services, the danger is that the people lose hope and trust in the process. And they stop thinking that their vote at the ballot box will deliver the kind of governance they want. When people lose that hope and trust in the formal systems, they get out and they start protesting, and then they eventually turn violent. And when it turns to a state where people are no longer believing that they can use lawful means to push their agenda and instead need to resort to violence, to a very, very dangerous situation. And sadly, we're at that moment in Haiti where more and more people have effectively, at least for the time being, have lost confidence in the democratic process and appear to believe that they need to use more radical measures to bring about political change.
Professor, I want to wrap up our conversation, again, going back to the article that you wrote, and I quote, again, this is something that you wrote in the article, and you said, the United States and its partners should use the prospect of security assistance to push the Haitian government to engage earnestly with opposition groups and civil society leaders on the transitional framework and path to elections. Now, the last question, how likely we're going to see another legal or official election take place in Haiti? So in other words, the country can't stay in this way. And of course, it costs lives, and also it costs energy. Of course, that it gains attention for international communities, but this is not the solution to the problem. So again, based on what you wrote, the U.S. should use the prospects of security assistance to push the Haitian government to engage with the opposition groups and civil society leaders so that we're going to see a major election take place soon. How likely we're going to see that, and how possible we can understand the outcome of the election?
It's quite possible that there will be other elections in the near term in Haiti, but it's not automatic. And this is a fundamental dilemma in big powers' engagement in fragile states. If I'm a big power, am I going to reward the leader of a fragile state for loyalty to me, or am I going to reward that leader for trying to engage various stakeholders to chart a more democratic and inclusive political future for the country? In most places, in most times, big powers reward loyalty. They want a leader who's going to think the way that they think, who's going to pursue the political agenda that favors their interests. And as a result, the leader gets further and further away from his or her own people and loses legitimacy. People get frustrated. They stop voting, they stop protesting, and they fight. Now, it's possible to change that story. It's possible for the United States, the French, the Canadians, the Mexicans, and others to decide that they're going to use their tremendous leverage over this fragile and embattled Haitian government to say what we demand is not loyalty. What we demand is inclusive democracy. And if they were to do that, there is some chance that the Haitian leadership would see no alternative but to go and consult broadly within the country on how to formulate a more sustainable political path forward. I believe that would be not only in the interest of Haitian citizens, but it would also be in the interest of the international community in building a more stable and prosperous state. But again, it requires a decision in Washington, in Ottawa, in Paris, and elsewhere to have what I would consider to be an enlightened foreign policy toward Haiti, to put aside our short-term interests and to think more long-term about what's likely to be conducive to peace building and development in that war-stricken country.
Well, Professor John Ciorciari is a professor and associate dean for research and policy engagement at the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. And of course, he's the author of the book, which is entitled Sovereignty Sharing in the Fragile States. Professor, thank you so much for taking your time to join the show. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, not only regarding Haiti, but also regarding the ongoing international crisis. Again, we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to follow and pay attention to progress within the Haitian government. Thank you, Professor, for doing this.